and in season 2, we have 6 themes, and today we have our 5th theme, which is private sector engagement. If you want to know about the previous webinars that we had, we will soon be sharing the links to the YouTube channel where you will be able to look at our previous discussions. We also have produced policy papers. You can have access to those policy papers, and also from today's discussion, the key points will be taken up for policy discussion. Without further ado, I have with me my esteemed panelists. Today we have a stellar cast of panelists. I'll have Dr. Mashoor Riaz, Chairman of the Policy Exchange of Bangladesh, delivering the keynote. And then I'll have Syed Akhtar Mahmood, former lead private sector specialist, World Bank, joining us as a panelist. I'll have Barrister Nihat Kabir as a panelist. I'll have Abul Qasim Khan, Director, AK Khan Company Limited, as a panelist. I'll have Fauzi Nasrin, Senior Technical Advisor, Swiss Contact, as a panelist. And then I'll have from the academia, Abdul Muhammad, Senior Lecturer, North South University. Mr. Mashoor Riaz, are you with us? Okay, as Mashoor Riaz is probably preparing, a few notes for everyone who's listening. You can have your say, so please keep your discussion flowing on the chat room. I'll take note as the moderator of today's session, and I'll relay the discussion to the panelists for their observations, but the panelists will also try to address your questions directly on the chat room. So to make the discussion fruitful, I kindly request all of you to please share your views on the chat room. And also, one important point is that today we'll be having the discussion in English because we'll have a lot of expatriates and foreign guests joining today. So my sincere apology to my Bangladesh audience if language is a barrier, but I'd also try as much as I can to mix the languages as I see as relevant and important. Dr. Mashoor Riaz, are you with us now?
I am, Rubaiyat. I think you can hear me well, I'm sure. Perhaps you can see me, but certainly my laptop video seems to be stuck. I can see a sort of frozen picture of myself, but I have a second device connecting me in parallel. Maybe you can see me through that. So hopefully that'll work. But
okay, I can see you very well now. Fantastic, all set. So over to you, Mashoor Riaz. There is a queue, so I suggest that you completely mute your other device.
Yeah. So Rubaiyat, are the hosts going to play the slides, or I will share the screen?
You take control.
I'll share the screen. Okay. Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Are the screens? Are the slides visible on the screen?
Very visible.
Excellent. All right, so I've just projected in big. So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join this excellent initiative by InnoVision on Bangladesh, marking Bangladesh's 50 years of independence and talking about Bangladesh's progress, challenges, and the horizon ahead, which is also partly our or part of our title on several areas. I congratulate Rubaiyat, Imran, and the entire InnoVision team. And it is also a great pleasure to speak here in the midst of really very distinguished panelists. I mean, I can see my very dear former colleague, Syed Akhtar Mahmood, who connected from DC very early morning. But we also have Barrister Nihat Kabir, AK Khan, Fauzi Nasrin, and Mr. Mohamed. I think could not have been a more rich, diverse panel than this one. So I think I have 15 minutes. Let me try to get on to the point. Today's session, it's about private sector. And when we connect private sector with the 50 years of Bangladesh's achievement, progress, and the journey since independence, I think it makes all sense to see, how the private sector and where and how it really supported Bangladesh's journey to its middle income status that it has achieved over the last few decades. And then what all sort of were the success factors, enablers, lessons that coming from this journey, as well as what the path ahead holds for Bangladesh, and how should Bangladesh prepare to take the maximum advantage or leverage the horizon we have ahead of us. So, Bangladesh's development performance, it requires no introduction. I mean, it's a stellar development success. It's a development role model, a middle income country or status within 5 decades since independence wasn't possible by many countries around the world who actually became independent since Bangladesh's or together with Bangladesh or before and after. The country is on track to become a $500 billion economy soon. It's according to IMF and the Standard Chartered Bank, and it has already exceeded $400 billion odd in the last fiscal year. If you look at the economic progress, social, human development, I mean, the trajectory since over the 5 decades is self-explanatory, excellent progress. But when you compare it with many peers, not only in South Asia, but also across Asia, Bangladesh stands out in terms of its development achievements. Of course, the sort of the foundation that kind of underpins this whole development journey is the very strong, resilient economic growth, which we see in the form of Bangladesh's consistent GDP growth, which has also been not only high and consistent, but very resilient through economic challenges and natural calamities and so on. Now, in this whole development journey, the private sector development, which if we see through the lenses of trade and investment, played a very important role. Over this period, when Bangladesh increased its GDP over 35 times, per capita income till 2019, I think this is the estimate till 2019, 18 times.
The slides are not moving. So if you are on slide 2, I request you to go to slide 2.
Is it moving now?
It is not yet. Maybe let me take over and see how it goes. Please go ahead. I'm going to settle this. You go ahead with your deliberation.
Yeah. So I think the role of the private sector, it is very much manifested in this development process. If you look at what happens to the trade journey, what happens to the manufacturing journey, the trade GDP ratio along this development path, it has more than doubled. From less than 18% 30 years ago to that of almost 36%. And a recent case, which is being discussed very intensely, is Sri Lanka. And I remember when I went there to do some work back in 14, 15, 16, one of the concern and one of the very strange observation we made was actually that Sri Lanka's trade GDP ratio was almost on a constant decline. One of the very few countries in Asia which not only did not grow their trade GDP or sort of trade share in the overall economic growth, but it rather declined. So if you move on, Rubaiyat, if you can move on next slide. But if you also look at beyond trade, if you also look at the manufacturing contribution of manufacturing, which actually is a very big jobs sort of driver. From I think Rubaiyat, you have a slightly earlier version. Okay, that's fine, no problem. I do have that. That's fine. So the manufacturing actually from a 9.7% contribution in the GDP, right at the beginning of the 80s, in 1979, it went up to 20% in 2019. Leading to many multiplier effects, jobs, income, wealth creation, expansion of supply chains, and so on. Next slide, please, Rubaiyat. So how do we see the private sector's contribution? I mean, if we are saying that the trade and investment had a great role in this development journey, what are some of the granular evidence that we see supporting this notion? It has been an important driver, as we said, across all the development and economic indicators. I mean, for investment, it's more than 75%. Energy, which till mid-90s was almost 100% public sector managed, generated, owned sector. It's 55% of energy generated is actually coming from the private sector in this country. Aviation, again, when we think of it, we think of Biman. However, 74% of market share is in aviation, and until mid-90s, we did not have any. Manufacturing, 8 million jobs, digital infrastructure, which is almost entirely, except for the one company, Teletalk, it's almost entirely private sector, be that internet, mobile, or the broadband. Food has been a great. You've seen in the previous slide that Bangladesh managed to, double its food production despite the loss of arable land by 1 percentage point almost every few years. However, now what made it possible? It is the private sector participation, starting from the farmer level, who happen to be slightly more disorganized but smaller, but yet private sector units of production, all the way through the supply chain and private sector aggregator. This grain distribution, it is almost entirely now private sector. 100,000 privately owned small mills, and that's a great departure from the government-led food rationing and distribution system that Bangladesh had in 70s and 80s. Exports, employment, all have the private sector as their key, Conrad. So next slide, Rubai. Now, if you look at some of the strategic interventions that private sector really enable in getting Bangladesh where it is, you can actually divide the journey into two phases, and I call them Bangladesh Private Sector 1.0 and 2.0. The 1.0, which is really, a little bit in 70s, but mostly in the 80s and 90s, the private sector really executed the three growth drivers which brought Bangladesh to a very strong foundation to move towards a middle income and a sort of a journey out of the least developed country, which finally materialized in last few years. The agriculture in the form of agri-productivity, agri-supply chain, the remittances which led to gainful jobs and consumer spending across the country, but more so in the rural areas, and the growth of RMG, which led to multiplier effects in broader manufacturing, employment, and services. They were all fueled and implemented, executed by private sector. So banking on that, Bangladesh looked high, Bangladesh aspired high, and the private sector 2.0 since 2000s actually helped modernize Bangladesh, and it's helped expand its economic base. The industrial and the connectivity infrastructure, private sector executed. Diversified sectors started emerging. The growth of pharma and health sector, the agro-processing, leather and footwear, construction, all are private sector. We hardly see presence of the government in any of this sector, which should remain actually out of business for better creation of and implementation of better enabling environment. Increasing global integration, which mainly help occurred through the exports, but also through imports, which supported the export-oriented as well as the domestic sector-oriented economy, executed to the private sector. The growth of the financial services, which still has a long way to go. We even 10 years ago, when we were looking at banking assets and liabilities, the four mammoth government banks were occupying the majority. But when you look at them now, both liabilities, assets, as well as client engagement and product development, private sector has totally taken the lead. Technology and the digital infrastructure, which is more of last 10 to 15 years journey, it is almost entirely executed by the private sector, which is the 2.0. And hopefully, once this 2.0 modernization and the expansion of the base happens, Bangladesh private sector 3.0 can come in, which will be more about high skill economy, knowledge economy, and innovation-led economy. Next slide, please. So what enabled the private sector to grow and contribute? So there are 5 areas of Bangladesh's economic management which were critical to enable the private sector to grow and contribute The macro policy management, which has been the strongest element of Bangladesh's economic management over the last at least 3 decades. Expansionary monetary policy, which supported growth of high potential sectors such as RMG, agriculture, remittances, and prudent balance between fiscal and monetary. Of course, domestic revenue mobilization has been always a challenge. Infrastructure policy, which over the last 2 decades saw major expansion in electricity, countrywide road connectivity, hinterland roads, and in the recent time, mega infrastructure such as MRT, airports, and so on, and the special economic zones agenda. That has become the principal industrial policy tool for the country. And I'm so glad that Akhtar Bhai is present with us, because he's the one who initiated the dialogue with the government of Bangladesh back in 2006 on behalf of the World Bank Group. And I was very fortunate to take the baton from him in 2010 and taking it forward in terms of the formulation of the law, the institution, and the infrastructure. The regulatory governance, you see the doing business reform, basically the improvement of business environment, which the discussion started, pilot started in the 2000s, but it paced up in the last few years. But more importantly, if you look back and since 1980s, the entry barriers for private sector and also foreign investors were gradually phased out since the 80s, and very little remain over there, at least in the letters of the law. The financial sector is mixed. Of course, the privatization of the financial sector and the private sector leading the financial services since 80s managed to provide the necessary growth finance for the private sector. However, the governance remains a critical concern, and so is access to finance by small businesses. Next slide, please. Just electricity as an enabler, just some numbers. Next slide. So we are still in the enablers. Next slide, please. Infrastructure as enablers. So if you look at this story in this private sector growth journey, several lessons come up, several interesting insights come up that actually explain a lot about both the success of the private sector, but also the political economic complexities, challenges, at times crony capitalism, or even regulatory capture. There are a few more bullets, Rubaiyat, so if you can bring them up in all together. So the origin of the private sector in Bangladesh, which is mostly has been emerging, previous slide, yes, thanks. Since 80s, I mean, you would see that denationalization and the vacuum left by the erstwhile Pakistani entrepreneurs who really dominated the manufacturing and other areas, whatever the size may have been, that started getting filled in with local entrepreneurs primarily since 80s. And many of them were traders in 60s and 70s who were involved in literally trading, like imports, primarily imports, very little exports. And they utilized their capital and also the links with the international markets, which they gained through their import experience to become the manufacturers and first movers, particularly in the RMG sector. The big expansion happened since late mid 90s, let's say, mostly family-owned conglomerates who ventured into multiple areas and contributed hugely, at least in job creation and also creating the base for several sectors. But of course, there remains a very healthy debate as to how much of diversification was really optimal by these conglomerates or not. But I think overall, since mid 90s, these conglomerates going into different space of the private sector really helped many of the industries to grow. Government support, we talked about in the form of the 5 economic sort of management principle, but obviously the growth supporting expansionary monetary policy, targeted support to high priority sectors such as ready-made garments and others have been really critical. Creative financing, as we know, financing has always been a constraint, although it grew significantly over the last few decades. But many of the entrepreneurs really used, sort of very innovative solutions to financing. The back-to-back LC, the great Mr. Nurul Qadir Khan, the Desh Garments, who came up with this concept, having a discussion with the Korean entrepreneurs, and went to the then finance minister and came up with the back-to-back LC as a very innovative financing mechanism. The cross company and many other areas. What was also important is this insider versus outsider concept, which basically links to political economy, can also lead to crony capitalism, but it did benefit. I mean, it's not unique to Bangladesh. Many developing countries have had this. Many emerging countries like Malaysia, China, India still have this insider versus outsider. The growth of Adani, Gautam Adani and Adani Group, to the richest group or perhaps the richest individual in Asia is a classic example that it happens not only in developing country, but also in strong emerging markets such as India. And that happened hugely in Bangladesh. There are downsides, but upside is it really also contributed in expansion of the private sector base. The corporate governance challenges, consolidation. So, there has been a kind of organic growth, which some may call non-strategic and in a form, in a sense, slightly disorganized, but eventually the consolidation comes in, the market discipline, competition, they comes in, and we are seeing the beginning, the very start of that. If you look at the BBS surveys, large firms are declining over last decade. Medium firms have also declined, but the good news is small businesses have been increasing. Next slide, please. But these lessons, success, the enablers, they're all great. They have enabled Bangladesh to take the maximum and the maximum advantage of the private sector, what a private sector can do for a country. But what's more important is what's next. Bangladesh really now needs to move to move faster towards upper middle income and ultimately to the vision of the high income country, the Vision 2041. That would require Bangladesh to increase its per capita income 5 times, increase private investment to GDP from 22% to 36%, a 70% increase. Just note how difficult it is. In the last 1 decade, there has only been it's largely stagnant, maybe a 1 percentage point increase. And then we are looking at 21 to 36% in Japan. Total volume of private investment would have to go up by 13 times, FDI by 6 times, 600%, export by 9 times. Now, all of these are very critical to create the necessary jobs, the quality of jobs, the necessary capital formation, the infrastructure, growth enabling infrastructure, both in industrial, but also in social category. So now, in order for these to happen, you can see these are, again, needs no introduction, no brainer. All of these need to be executed to the private sector, to the growth of the private sector. So what's the horizon for Bangladesh? Let's, next slide, Rubai. Next slide is just what Bangladesh needs as vision to attain Vision 2041. Next slide. So what is it that Bangladesh has in the horizon? A lot of it are actually going to be determined by the dominant mega trends in the globe. Not only what's happening in Bangladesh or what Bangladesh requires, but we will be taker or we will be gainers if we can align to the dominant global trends. And the first dominant global trend that we are already in, and it's going to get bigger, is the digital economy wave. Already 15% of the global GDP, and it's going to get bigger. 70% of the new value created in 2030 are going to come from the digital economy. And this particular economy or economic approach is going to create between 20 million to 50 million jobs, something Bangladesh needs most as a development outcome to move to the next phase of its growth achievements by 2030. Similarly, another very big global trend, next slide please, Rubai, is the rise of the green economy. We have been hearing about climate change for at least a good 1 to 2 decades now. So what's really heartening, what's really encouraging is that countries around the world, experts around the world, government, private sector, are finally trying to see the silver lining through this cloud, the cloud being the climate change, and trying to convert this into economic opportunities. And that's where green economy comes in. This is going to be 10% of the total global economy by 2030. And, this whole green economy could lead to 24 million new jobs with a $23 trillion investment opportunity. And in that $23 trillion, just in the next 8 years, between 2020 and 2030, 8 years left, Bangladesh has a private sector investment opportunity of 172 billion in the form of green economic investment. Next slide, please. But the growth of the private sector, the continued and increasingly stronger role of private sector is also embedded in Bangladesh's development priorities. Bangladesh is in a critical need to expand its export economic base, the economic diversification, export-led growth, diversification of export basket. We are seeing a high increasing concentration in RMG. 10 years ago, it was 82, 83%. 10 years down the road, it's 84% plus. If you look at our exports, promising one, ICT, agriculture, compare it with Thailand and Malaysia, we need to do a lot better, and it has to happen through private sector. Next slide, please. So just continuing on this, the development rationale, Bangladesh's own development rationale, which lends the field to the private sector. You know, moving up the value chain, Bangladesh is, if you look at the right-hand side box, Bangladesh is in the light gray category, low skill, labor intensive economy. We really need to go up to the, at least, if not the top, but the second top, the highly skilled technology intensive one. Next slide, please. Jobs is another agenda that Bangladesh, as I say, it's the biggest thing Bangladesh needs. And creating not only more jobs, but also better jobs will primarily have to come from private sector. And that is needed for, stopping the kind of stagnating job creation rate, but also improve the job quality. As you see, the informality, the labor productivity is really low in labor productivity is really low in Bangladesh compared to its peers. Informality is higher. Next slide, please. But can the private sector grow? The rationale is clear. The need is very strong, but can it grow? Yes, because there are many opportunities that lead to strong potential, long-term stable growth outlook. Bangladesh is expected to remain, the third fastest growing economy, according to PwC, for the next 30 years almost, transforming into a $3 trillion economy by next 25, 26 years. Next slide, please. The demographic dividend, which countries envy, the Western countries, Japan, they would give anything they have just to reverse the population pyramid they have, which is very top heavy. Bangladesh has it for at least another 5 decades, and really sort of a big input to what Bangladesh can do in terms of manufacturing services and so on. Next slide, please. If you look at Bangladesh's infrastructure needs, if you look at Bangladesh's growing middle class, so as you know, several firms have now said that the middle and affluent class, which is I think $450 a month at least or above, Bangladesh is going to have 34 million of them. That is larger than many European country population, many East Asian country population. Investment in infrastructure and logistics, 2 to 3% at the moment. We have done a lot better than we did in the past, but it's nowhere close to what we need. So each of them create an opportunity for private sector. COVID has kind of made it or exposed it severely, but this was in the making due to global politics or evolution in the sort of broader geopolitical issues, expansion of supply chain beyond China, where it's hugely concentrated, was coming, and the COVID has just made it even a greater reality, or perhaps a faster reality. Bangladesh remains very competitive. As you see, our wage, if you take the case of RMG sector, Bangladesh is 71% cheaper than China, even 24% cheaper than Vietnam, and which is growing. And it remains one of the top 3 hotspots for RMG sourcing over the next decade or so. Next slide, please. The infrastructure I mentioned, that from 2 to 3%, it needs to really go to 7 to 8%. What does it entail? More specific, granular opportunity. $608 billion needed till 2040, $24 billion annually. And government can't do much of that because the government has to take care of many growing areas. Development finance is going to shrink as the country grows economically or socially. But also in terms of very specific areas, the 100 economic zones agenda, I don't think 100 is going to come, but even if 20 comes, I think that is going to create huge investment opportunity for private sector, not only as tenants in those sectors, but as zone developers, operators, infrastructure facilitators, and then logistics or trade infrastructure, where Bangladesh is which is Bangladesh's weakest link. Bangladesh has developed roads, has developed electricity, quality can go up, but at least the quantity is there, where Bangladesh doesn't have almost anything, or at least it doesn't support Bangladesh's current needs, let alone the 2041, 2031 needs, is the trade infrastructure. But that's where just I name a few that are all being lined up to support Bangladesh's growth. Next slide, please. Next slide is just the infrastructure part. Next slide. Yeah, the digital economy, as I say, why would Bangladesh become a digital economy investment or digital economy led private sector growth, both services as well as perhaps manufacturing, digital device manufacturing. I mean, 50% of the population has digital experience through mobile phone. Mobile phone penetration is, as far as I remember, 106%. Internet penetration is close to 100%. $3 billion e-commerce market by 2023. And the growing ICT, IT-enabled services, digital financial services, as well as the startup ecosystem, they all make a very lucrative destination for both foreign investment and local investment to come and anchor in the private sector in the country. Next slide, please.
Mashur bhai, you need to wrap up in 1 minute.
So next 2 to 3 minutes, So just some examples how Bangladesh can be it has the potential to be highly competitive. Next slide. But in order to do so, what Bangladesh will have to do is make a fundamental shift in its strategy. The strategy over the last 2 decades has been banking on the labor cost differential. It has a very competitive labor cost, also a good labor size. However, the horizon ahead requires Bangladesh to have better compliance with international markets, regulatory systems which invokes confidence, productivity led by skills and technology, and so on. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense, some broader, very broad level constraints that limit the growth of private sector in Bangladesh. Tax and tariff, trade, the investment policy and regulations, industrial infra. Some of them are seeing incremental improvement, but Bangladesh will need to go into a steep and fast modernization and reform approach on many of these areas. Next slide, please. This is just to show how RMG is resilient. However, concentration is really a problem. Next slide, please. How Bangladesh, just an example, how Bangladesh's business environment needs to upgrade. The doing business doesn't exist any longer. We have developed a local index, Bangladesh Business Climate Index, which puts Bangladesh right at the beginning of, let's say, a moderately good business environment, which really cannot support the 2041 vision. Next slide, please. The trade environment, as you can see through different trade indices of the world, where Bangladesh stands. Next slide, more specific. If you see a few more clicks, Rubaiyat, it has a few, just gives you a comparison that import in Bangladesh takes 360 hours, but India is 85 hours, Vietnam is 132 hours, just to give you an example how Bangladesh needs to be more competitive. Next slides. Just high-level trade constraints starting from tariff, need for greater integration opportunities through trade agreements, logistics costs. Next slides. As I said, the digital economy is the future. Whether Bangladesh can take advantage of it will require addressing many areas. For example, it still favors mainly large companies, but without the growth of small companies, small and medium in the digital economy, the sector cannot grow. US, India are all great examples. Intellectual property rights framework is actually, turning away many of the global investors from Bangladesh in this particular area. Next slide. Skills, which is extremely important. Bangladesh, again, something like trade infrastructure, where Bangladesh really lags behind. Some of the comparison, and I've disaggregated into business skills, technology, data. And as a result, if you look at export per capita, when you go to labor-intensive manufacturing, Bangladesh does really well. But the moment you go to skill-intensive manufacturing and even higher, Bangladesh is really behind, $3 per capita, whereas I think South Asia is $35 export per capita. China and Vietnam are hundreds of dollars. Next slide. Next slide. So a few more clicks. Just some examples of how the skills agenda is constrained in every phase or every part of the labor market value chain, whether it's on the demand side or supply side, whether it's the technology changes, economic environment, or public-private participation. Next slide, please. So we propose that there are, a five-pronged agenda, policy and sort of improvement agenda, which can facilitate the private sector growth by enabling more or crowding in more domestic and foreign investment. Make the entry and operations easier. You have some examples. Make trade and investment policies greater connected. One can support each other. The example of Vietnam, example of China, or even in India in certain sector. Investment incentives don't only limit it to tax incentives. Bring in productivity, bring in skills, bring in incentives which actually offer a better business environment. Very targeted investment promotion, not only FDI, but local investment promotion. It's very open-ended at the moment, it doesn't work. And connecting the domestic supply chain with the FDI, which actually helps the SME sector to grow. Final slide, I think. And I think most important would be moving away from a general, as I said, open-ended, but also very general, non-strategic approach to support private sector development, PSD, to leverage what are emerging as strategic enablers, shifts in global chain, China +1, expansion beyond China, take advantage, use exports to anchor FDI, and develop local supply chain to bring in private investment. 8,256 products in Chinese market has got free duty-free access for Bangladesh since 2020. We haven't been able to take advantage of in one category yet. When you can actually take advantage of these, not only Bangladeshis can actually make the products sent to China, but many of the Chinese, East Asian, and maybe European companies are going to come settle their factories here and send to China. Global economic cooperation such as FTA, non-traditional sources of private investment, as I mentioned, agribusiness, digital economy, climate investment, and very systematic targeting of investments, as I mentioned. So I think that brings us to the end of the slides. Thank you very much. It's a big and very interesting subject. Sorry, I took 10 minutes extra, but I hope you found it useful. Very happy to respond to any comments and questions. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Mashoor Bhai. That would be a very important document, I believe, on the way forward for Bangladesh. But one important point that you said, I reiterated, you talked about private sector development 1, 2, and the 3 that you said is forthcoming would be about high-skilled economy and knowledge economy, and you really laid the foundation for and the significance of it, and you explained to us what would be required, and you highlighted the significance of diversification. With that regard, there are 2 questions for you on the chat room. Please look at those. And our audience is asking you basically why we are not being able to, let's say, reduce the reliance on RMG. Why can't we grow, let's say, sectors like agriculture? So please have your take on that as I bring in my other participants, panelists. Dear audience, who of you are joining, we are talking about private sector development in Bangladesh. And as you know, it has been put forward as an important development agenda by the government of Bangladesh in the 8th five-year plan. And just information for all of your record, in the first 5-year plan, we had 89% of investment coming from the state. And in the current 8th five-year plan, we have 81% investment coming from private sector. That actually indicates that the significance of the topic and the vastness of it that we're talking about. I will try to bring together all the discussion for all your assistance. I have with me Barrister Nihat Kabir joining. I have with me K. Kashim Khan joining. Can I have you all, my panelists, on a video, please? If you may, please come over video. That would be really helpful for me. Super. Nihat, can you listen? Can you hear me? Am I audible? Mr. A.K. Kashim Khan, am I audible? Are you here with us, Mr. Khan?
Yes,
you're audible.
Yes, I can hear you. I'm joining.
Oh.
I'm just.
Super, no
going to my-
issues, no issues, no
Give
issues.
me 5 minutes.
No issues. So we are taking the discussion forward. Just give me a second as I try to get back to the original slides. So sometimes it doesn't just allow. So we were listening to the keynote, and I have been now joined by Nihat Kabir and Fawzia Nasreen. You are there with us. So I'll just, go to you first before I move on to the other panelists. We have been listening to the investment side of private sector, but there's also this other aspect of equality, equity, and inclusive development, which is emphasized in the 8th Five-Year Plan, and is a very important agenda. And you have been working for decades now, 2 decades almost, working with the private sector to take them to the bottom of the pyramid, working both on the supply side and the forward and backward linkages. So from your experience, please highlight to us the importance of working with the private sector and helping them to grow, equally and to ensure pro growth. Over to you, Fawzia Nasreen. And after that, I'll come to Nihat Kabir. So Fawzia Nasreen, over to you.
Thank you, Rubaiyat. Thank you, Masroor Bhai. That was awesome. I think you touched upon all the right spots of the topic. Rubaiyat, your question about why it's important, I think Masroor Bhai covered that. In terms of, I think as development programs and as facilitators, what we call ourselves, I think we can do a lot in terms of contributing to the private sector development. And I think it's what's very important with the private sector is that I think more and more the private sector is realizing the importance of being inclusive. And I think if I go 10, 15 years back, when we started working in this field, it was difficult. Okay, but now I think it's really for development programs. I think three key things are important when we work with private sector is to really ensure that the private sector has the mindset to do things differently for inclusion. Okay, it's of course about profits, but I think it's the people matters. People in the management, in the company, do they have the mindset to be more inclusive? Second, it's definitely about the value proposition. And I think Masroor Bhai very nicely came across that. Showing the private sector the value proposition of being inclusive is very important. Now, for that, we might have to do piloting, we might have to do research, but very much targeted to the kind of services and products that the private sector we are looking at. And the third thing I would highlight is what's important for the private sector, and we know as private sector in Bangladesh and in anywhere is risk. The amount of risk is what they always are scared of, right? And how much do I invest? Is it too risky? Is the new market segment too remote? Can I send out my people out there? Do I have a right logistics for that? So I think thinking through with the private sector of how you can mitigate the risk of being innovative is what we can help out with. So with that key three kind of points on private sector development, or how as development practitioners we can support that, I will just quickly touch upon two kind of models or examples from my work. This is more based through my work in the African countries, where we are always trying to look at models that can be inclusive, right? So I think it's also important to understand that a business model can be inclusive by looking at the rural population or the vulnerable population in remote areas, both as consumers and as producers. So if I take an example, how that can happen in terms of a case from Uganda, actually, where there is this, it's a bit same like what we have here. There is this big agro-processing companies. They are always on the lookout for good quality products. They always need good volumes because they're exporting. But then, of course, getting the right quality, right volume in the right time is always difficult. So there was this program that supported them to look at how they can set up, I would say, call it mobile aggregators rather, and they call this group of people commercial agents. So what they did was, they kind of, the program stepped in, and of course it's a risky thing to start with a new idea. So they had to put in money, a bit of a piloting. where they identified commercial agents from vulnerable or remote locations, remote villages, where, for instance, cotton is growing very well, but the processing company does not have the logistics or do not want to invest in logistics to reach out there for a certain volume, okay? So I think the program was key in introducing or doing the research, doing the pilot, in setting up that system to kind of convince the private sector, the agro-processor, that if you have these commercial agents and if you invest in their capacity development to understand what quality you need and timing and all that, you can actually gain volume. So, and what we did, we really did a very quantitative value proposition chart for the private sector to really show them. So this is how the comparison would be, what value they would bring in. So what I'm just trying to say is that to engage with producers who are based in very remote locations, they are probably producing some cotton, but just because it's probably, I don't know, a certain X amount, which is not lucrative for the processors, they're just not taking it out to the market. So by this commercial agent model, these small producers were able to come together from different locations, and the commercial agent, there was an incentive system where the processing company started to buy from them. That was from rather like being inclusive from the producer's point of view. My second example is about how we can engage with the private sector to motivate or to build, to facilitate them to look at these remote or population in the villages or in the remote locations to look at as a consumer point of view. Now, another example from Rwanda is where a program is looking at how some of the vulnerable communities out there have this nutrition issue. So they are not getting they're not intaking the right quantity and volume of food that they need for their health. So what they did is they started to look at how we can ensure that the private sector who are out there, small, medium, large, can actually develop systems to develop products that are affordable, but also that reach these vulnerable communities. And in that sense, there are multiple models. I won't go into the details, but what I'm just trying to say is that there was multiple strategies that program, private sector development program, employed to work with larger agro-processors, to work with middle-sized traders, to develop models of integration. So how you could, for instance, a large size sector were not interested to go into those locations, but then through smaller traders, they were able to reach this segment and also develop the information and research on understanding of what kind of products are really necessary and what is affordable for them. So they started to develop these products that were animal source foods. So they were looking at the nutrition perspective, and the program supported in that research. And then eventually there was a distribution system that was developed in a very commercial manner that could reach this vulnerable population very well. So I'm just trying to say that, again, recapping, is that with private sector discussion and what Masroor Bhai has actually pointed out very well at a macro level, there are these interesting models that as development programs we can actually adopt. And we, again, going back to my first 3 points, it's really about mindset, value proposition, and looking at the risks of the business model that can really help the private sector to do new things, but then also make this faster. Probably these will anyway happen, but with our support, with development programs, this can happen even earlier. That's it from my side. Over to you, Rubaiyat.
So much, Fauzia. Thank you so much. That was crisp. Just to connect the discussion again, you are emphasizing on the need for private sector's mindset and the value proposition business model to be facilitated to become more equitable and inclusive. And I think the connection between what you're saying and what Masroor Bhai is saying is that private sector would be key for the future. It's key already. It would remain to be dominant force in growth of Bangladesh. But the point is, as it grows, if it is not inclusive enough, what you're trying to say, there is a chance that it might not essentially be inclusive.
You're right. Yeah.
So if the business model or the value proposition is not tailored to the need of the people who are left behind. So what you're saying, if I connect it to what Masroor Bhai is saying, is that as we strive towards green economy, digital economy, and so on and so forth, if care is not taken, it might become obtrusive for inclusive growth. There might be a chance for that. So let's keep that. Question. I would specifically ask Akhtar Bhai to also, think about this point when I get back to you. But coming back to Nihad Appa, are you there with me?
Yes, sir.
Great. Let me just go to you. Yes.
Right.
So, Nihadaba, so we have been talking about, Mashoor Bhai, has very clearly articulated the significance, importance, and the way forward. And he also highlighted some of the challenges on private sector development. You have been, a critical part of this growth journey and in various roles. And you are currently the president of MCCI. So my question to you is that, when you look at the enabling environment side, I understand that there are still pains, despite the fact that lots of policy interventions are being taken. My question is why these challenges remain? What are these key challenges? And what do you recommend that we should be doing to address these enabling environment challenges? Over to you, Nihadaba.
Thank you very much, Rubaiyat. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. And I got stuck in one of the side effects of our growth, which is the extreme traffic. I know it's a daily sob story for all of us, but I think there are some lessons to be learned there as well. After what Mashoor has presented, actually, there's not a lot to say. It's been very, very comprehensive. And I had the opportunity of going through the slide deck, and he has highlighted where we want to go and pretty much how we want to go there. Now, you're talking about the business enabling environment. So let me just make a quick correction. I'm no longer the president of MCCI. I'm on the board, but I'm chairing BUILD, the BUILD Trust, which is a public-private dialogue platform. So in a way that puts me right in the center of the discussions we are having on regulatory reform, puts me in the middle of that from the private sector. MCCI and Policy Exchange, we put together an index, the Bangladesh Business Climate Index. It's a single country index. It's benchmarking, it's the first index was put out last year. It benchmarks on 10 pillars what the specific problems are which businesses are facing, which was gleaned through interviews with businesses, not interviews with intermediaries, as many other such indexes are done. And from there, one of the biggest issues, as we all point out, is the quality of the regulatory framework. Now, we have inherited a regulatory framework historically, which was designed to control from a distance, be it from the Mughal Sultanate in Delhi, be it from the Imperial British in London, and be it from the Pakistan regime in Islamabad. To an extent, we have been working a lot on this, and the speed of working on this has increased over the last 10, 15 years. We are trying to modify that framework to remove the control aspects and put in place facilitation aspects. Now, what I would like to say, looking at it from a slightly different point of view, is that going forward, we know the case for Bangladesh's private sector. We have seen how it has spurred the growth of the country, the economy, and we have seen that how it has the potential to continue to do so. It is 80+% of our economy, it's in the private sector. And the policymakers are on record as saying that the private sector is the engine of growth. We have just started the conversation of moving away from control to facilitation, and this has to be done, this growth potential to be unlocked has to be done on the basis of public-private cooperation. Historically, we have seen that there has been an antagonistic relationship between the regulators and the private sector. It is no longer possible to go forward on that basis, and I think that understanding is clearly there, but centuries of conditioning need to be changed. Training on the public sector sides needs to change. And the whole philosophical approach to governance needs to change. So we are now talking about the quality of the regulatory framework. What are we trying to achieve with the regulatory framework? There are laws in the books from 1820. Do we really need that? Are those laws really relevant in 2022? Most likely not. But if somebody wants to stop me they'll go and find a copy of that law, they wave it around in a court and get an order. We are trying to get rid of that. Clear out, I've suggested that, throw away 50-60% of the laws in the books, just take a year, like, 1950, and throw the laws before that out. It's really not going to harm our regulatory framework very much. Put in only those bits which are necessary, which are clear, which are transparent, and which are applicable to everybody on the same footing. It's not that a particular law is applied to me in one way and the same law is applied to you in another way. It can't be that way. So that is the focus now. The focus is on ensuring internal and external governance of corporates in the private sector. The internal governance of corporates and the external governance issues, the whole system in the country. The focus is on increasing the quality of the support services that the government needs to provide for the private sector to access markets within the country and outside the country. One issue is the certification, quality and standard certifications, for example. We're working on that. Progress could be much faster, and it should be much faster. As I have said, that we've started the dialogue, we've started some of the work, but we need to move much faster. We can't afford to wait for incremental changes here. Companies Act, it's undergoing reform. One of the biggest sectors which needs serious reform for the business enabling environment to really step up is the revenue system. And just before this, we were having a dialogue on how the domestic revenue mobilization can be improved. As we know, Bangladesh's tax revenue ratio has been below 10% for decades and decades and decades. And whatever change, whatever reform we hear about is obviously not giving the impetus that we need. We need to look at that very seriously. So labor laws. Today, we cannot avoid international scrutiny, not that we want to avoid it. Corporates are very aware of the fact that the health and safety requirements of workers are paramount. We are trying to bring our laws in line with international practices. The laws are there. It is the application and enforcement which needs to be upgraded. It needs to be not intrusive enforcement, not irrational enforcement, but it needs to fulfill the specific purpose of ensuring the health, safety, productivity of workers, at the same time as bearing in mind the requirements of industry as a whole. So these are some of the issues which are happening, which are ongoing at the moment. And there's no end to it. Arbitration, judicial, I'm a lawyer, so I have to talk about dispute settlement. We have found in our various reviews that one of the things foreign investors and local investors are most upset about is the length of time it takes to resolve a dispute. I was having a conversation with some foreign clients day before yesterday, and when we told them that it might take 10 more years to get an arbitration award enforced, I mean, they were absolutely speechless. And I was no end embarrassed to have to give them that sort of a timeline. So we are reviewing the Arbitration Act. So law by law by law, we're doing it. I just wish we could do it faster, because if we could do it quickly, then this economy, the speed at which it will grow, and the way in which it will be able to fulfill our requirements and the aspirations of our young population, that would be something really to see. I'm going to finish by just addressing what Fawzia said just before me, and the topic, that the issue of social inclusion. I have to say that Bangladesh's growth, we just see the very high income people and very low income people, and there's this whole, conversation going on about it. But there's a huge middle that has benefited significantly from the economic growth. And Bangladesh's growth story really is a story of not leaving too many people behind. If you go out into the countryside, you will see it with your own eyes. Our successes in meeting the MDGs, our commitment to meet the SDGs as far as we can, the economic growth has carried a large, significantly large proportion of our population along the path of social development and inclusion also. And I think that is a very, that is something that I take great pride in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niyadapa. I totally echo with your point. I mean, having worked in Africa, I mean, Middle East and Central Asia, and I can also bet on that. I really have seen, I mean, how inequalities are in those countries and how much we have done probably. Important point that you mentioned about the philosophical approach that needs to change. You spoke about the historical antagonistic approach between the government, the regulators, and the private sector, which needs to change. And also you put emphasis on the need for systems change with regards to building the quality of the support systems. You spoke about the labor laws, and arbitration comes over and over again. I believe if I had Rumi Bhai here, I mean, could have shared his pains on that issue. So fantastic, thank you so much. I wish I could really listen more. Time is running fast. But Mr. Khan, if you're there with me, I would like to go to you now.
Sure, I'm here.
Super. So, Mr. Khan, I mean, you're talking about private sector, and you are the private sector here. So, honestly speaking, I mean, of course, Niyadapa is a private sector, but I consider herself more as a facilitator. So, to you, I really want to listen from you about, I mean, let's say in your journey in private sector, I mean, what you have seen as the pains of private sector in Bangladesh, and how the private sector has contributed to overcoming those barriers. What lessons can we learn from it?
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here. Nihat Kabir is senior to me, so she is more private sector than me. Amazing presentation by Dr. Masroor Riaz, as usual. Brilliant. I think he covered all the points. We all know the changing landscape of Bangladesh. We can see, and I think we are a generation that grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We can see the change very visible from where we were and from where are we currently. And that is very interesting to see this transformation of a country from a poor Bangladesh to a rising Bangladesh. I think it's beautiful. The private sector has been the driving force for Bangladesh. And I will just talk about the areas that we feel there are challenges to overcome. But let me first start with saying that we have come a long way, and the private sector today contributes a major, is the major contributor, generating about 80% of the economic activities. And today you can see Bangladesh is one of the fastest growing countries. And will remain one of the fastest growing countries until the year 2050, as per the PricewaterhouseCoopers report. So the continuity of Bangladesh as a growth model, inshallah, will continue. If you see certain figures which are, I would say, very attractive, we have a huge population with an advantage of which we call the demographic dividend. So that kind of creates the sustainability of a population that will be able to invest, that will move your domestic consumption high. And if we can rightly position this workforce, I think we can also benefit in many ways in the ICT digital spectrum. Huge purchasing power rising, which Masroor touched upon. The MAC would reach 34, 35 million people. It's larger than many countries. The good part is the RMG success story. I think we have kind of made Bangladesh visible in the RMG, and now we have to replicate the RMG success stories in the other sectors, which we have not done quite well. If you talk about the progress of Bangladesh private sector, it was in the 80s when the banking and the insurance sector opened up, which created a new entrepreneurs and created new economic activity. Then came the 1990s, where We saw the telecommunication sector open up with the media also being given to the private sector. That also opened up a new horizon. Then came the 2000s, where we saw aviation, ports, power, innovation companies, ICT companies opening up, giving license like Bcash and others. So Bangladesh has come a long way from the 80s or the 70s. Now, in terms of struggles, the most important area, we are struggling. We could have been better in many ways. There are policy constraints with which Barrister Nihat Kabir rightly pointed out. There is, I think, there is some disconnection between the policy planners and where the business community thinks. This disconnect needs to be further connected or maybe connected in a better way. So there are problems in the entire policy framework. If you say from taxation to the various policies, we are continuously fighting with the government, where I think if the policies were developed in consultation with the private sector, then the policy fighting or policy mapping would be less and it would be more synced with the business community. So if I can target or if I can identify 4 or 5 areas, one would be expanding the economic freedom. Expansion of economic freedom would entail investment, domestic consumption. So there are processes that need simplification to give your citizens more power, economic power to invest in Bangladesh and also to consume more, which would create more economic activity. So I think that is a big challenge for Bangladesh. Kind of policy kind of restricts our economic freedom through taxation and other means, where the economy, I think, can flourish or accelerate in a faster mode if we can do that. So I think expanding economic freedom would be one. Obviously, increasing trade and investment would be automatically done if you expand the economic freedom of the citizens of Bangladesh. And then build on your new competitive areas. You know, Bangladesh has been by default competitive in the workforce or the labor market, but we need to create new competitive areas. We are lacking, as Masroor rightly pointed out, in the infrastructure logistics areas. We are not very competitive. So we need to increase our competitive and comparative advantages. That is a challenge for Bangladesh, where we think that in order to facilitate the growing economy, the economy that we envision in 2030 and 2041, from a higher middle income to a developed country, the infrastructure need or the infrastructure requirement needs to reach about 6 to 8% of your GDP, which would entail a lot of investment. Now, currently, if you see, we are only getting about $2 to $3 billion investment in terms of FDI, but we require, as Masroor rightly pointed out, nearly $20 billion. So if you think that $20 billion coming into a country every year, the entire landscape of your infrastructure, economic landscape would change. That is where we want to go, and that is where the private sector needs to be engaged. I think there is a lack of initiative to engaging the private sector in the infrastructure logistic part of the economy. So this is something we are, from the private sector, dealing with the government on a daily basis, informing them that there is a lack and we need to improve. There is a supply shortage where the private sector can come in and give you that investment. So also domestic industrial diversification, which also caters to your export diversification, is important to look at. And that is where we think that outward investment for Bangladeshi companies in order to grow into multinational and regional companies is very important. Maybe it's not the right time to discuss because we have a shortage of foreign exchange, but we should think on creating enterprises, of Bangladeshi enterprises that become global enterprises, and whereby the only way possible is to buy or get into other markets and buy companies where you overnight become regional, you overnight become global, I think that is where we need to focus, where India and other countries are maximizing their supply end and market penetration, buying companies across the world. If you see Tata in the, I think in the early 2000s bought Land Rover, a British company, and Tata got the technology and the know-how of Land Rover overnight. And now you see the Tata cars have evolved and are comparable to other manufacturers. So this is something that Bangladesh needs to upgrade its value chain. And this is where I think going into external market is important. So I think I've covered almost all the areas.
Thank you.
I would end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Khan. That's a brilliant point. I'm so glad that you have raised it about, I mean, we often talk about this point, why Bangladeshi companies are not going global. And so it's a very important point that you've mentioned. I think, I mean, it requires a lot of policy incentives and support. I hope we had time to discuss further on that, but your point on increasing FDI inflow, that's also very important, I believe. And I think, I mean, those who are listening are taking note of the very important points that you have mentioned today. And you also spoke about, I mean, the competitive and comparative advantages needs to change for us to diversify. Having said that, I mean, there are some questions. So Mashroor Bhai, Mr. Khan, I mean, could you please directly answer to those questions on the chat room, because we are running out of time. I would not be able to take those questions for discussion, but appreciate if you could directly answer those questions on the chat room. I'll go to Mumit. Mumit, are you there with me?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so you were presenting the academia, and the reason why we have it here, I mean, the academia as our partner for this discussion on Bangladesh Miracle presented by Innovation Consulting in association with North University, is because, I mean, we believe that to take the country forward, the academia needs to play a very important role on preparing not only the students, but also on providing insights and evidence and policy support. So my question to you is how the academy is currently engaged in private sector development, and what role do you envision, and what the gaps are? Over to you.
Thank you. I could perhaps do better explaining by sharing my screen. If you, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. And as someone who's involved in both academia and also the private sector, perhaps I can claim that I sit on both sides of the fence. If we speak of industrial and academia collaboration, in some ways we say that universities are typically committed to teaching, research, personal and intellectual growth of students. On the other hand, the corporations or the private sector is the primary objective is to deliver shareholder value and provide returns to shareholders. So in some ways, we can ask that whether these divergent needs are compatible, and can even both institutions collaborate. And for us, the answer is a resounding yes, because both universities and companies are changing. Corporate culture is embracing openness more and more. And companies are also realizing that they need to make their findings more socially relevant. So just an interesting infographic here, which shows the investments made by, this is data from the US, by investments by higher education institutions and business firms on different types of research. And here we see these are completely opposite over the years. But this also tells us that these are complementary, which means that if we combine the efforts or investments of both types of institutions, then you could also achieve optimal outcomes from here. From the side of a university or an academic, there are many reasons why you could or you would wish to access the private sector. This could be varied also from the student's perspective. but also from the perspective of the faculty.
Wait, can you click on the slideshow, because we can't really see? Yeah,
That's helpful. Okay.
yeah, better. Thank
So also to connect the research of the faculty to real world problems, things like this. Okay, now let's come to the real question of how do universities and the industries collaborate, at least also in the context of Bangladesh. So we identify mainly 4 major ways of this collaboration. And firstly is that universities, through their collaboration with the private sector, can lead to societal impact, because universities are generally good at fundamental discoveries and industry is good at translating these discoveries. So one way for universities to provide societal impact is to partner with a corporation or other businesses and develop a discovery into something that the society can use. Obviously, there's also a benefit in terms of student opportunities and outcomes through collaboration with the private sector. There's increased opportunities for funding. And if you look at how industries or the overall economy can gain from such collaboration, then we can refer to something called a triple helix. This is a common analytical tool used in the educational sector, where the university, education, and the government, 3 institutional agents or 3 elements, and which goes away from, or is the next step from, let's say, simple political economy, whereby innovation is done entirely ad hoc basis by 3 institutions separately. But through collaboration, a helix is formed, meaning that a more prominent role for universities in innovation on par with industry and government. There's a lot more opportunity for collaborative relationship between these 3 institutional spheres. And innovation is increasingly then an outcome of interaction rather than prescription from either of these institutions. And lastly, each institutional sphere also takes the role of the other, performing new roles as their traditional functions. Having said that, this is how it should work, but also this is not how it works in Bangladesh in most cases. So in Bangladesh, mostly these 3 spheres remain as separate sectors, and with not very good examples of productive interaction in which knowledge is jointly developed and shared. The fundamental constraint that we identify is a lack of understanding and mutual trust among the 3 sectors. So universities develop their strategies with little or no involvement or reference to the industrial stakeholders. And similarly, industries tend to see universities as ivory towers, bureaucratic, and too focused on consensus building than meeting their needs. A last constraint is that the institutional framework for public universities, which are at times those with the greatest potential for innovation, is not conducive to establishing partnerships with the industry. So by identifying these gaps, I would also like to highlight some of the programs that we are doing from our university at North-South here, where we generally classify our activities into 3 major groups. So in terms of forming university-wide agreements, targeted and non-targeted, in creating focused structures. Let's say there are specific programs in North-South University for startups. It's called NSU Startups Next, and it already has the 2nd batch running, through which startups are incubated to shape and support their early stage development. There's the Center for Business Research, which tries to collaborate with the industry. Center for Infrastructure Research and Services, which is an initiative by the Civil Engineering Department, also involved in working with the industry. There's the South Asian Institute for Policy and Governance, which engages the private and public sector in policy dialogue, policy advocacy. North-South University also actively is involved in research projects There are around 30 active projects with industry and also different development organizations. There are 83 internal projects just within the last year that has been initiated and are active. There's also the electrical department, which does technological research collaboration with the RMG industry, also the Water Development Board. So the list is by no way exhaustive, but this is just to highlight some of the efforts that North-South University by itself is taking time on. Thank you. Saurabh, that brings
so
me
much, Mohit. That was crisp once again. I think, I mean, the point that you mentioned about the triple helix model and the disconnect between the industry, university, and the government, I think is very well understood. And thank you so much for highlighting some of the initiatives that North-South University has been taking. And I believe the other academic institutions are taking note of this developments, the suggestions that you have made. I will quickly go to Akhtar Bhai now. You have been doing an active listening for more than an hour now, and lots of knowledge that has been shared, lots of recommendations that has been shared. So Akhtar Bhai, you have been a pivotal force in facilitating private sector development in Bangladesh through your works, research, and facilitation and interventions. So to you now I come, and my question to you has two aspects. One is what I'm hearing from my other panelists is that probably private sector can work as a conduit or a keystone for Bangladesh to have more inclusive, sustainable growth in the future. So how do you think the private sector can play a role as a keystone for the development of Bangladesh to become more inclusive? And also the second question would be that from all this discussion that we have had, what are your key takeaways? What are the messages that you'd like to take forward and share with the world and our policymakers? Over to you, Akhtar Bhai.
Well, thank you very much, Rubaiyat. Thank you for inviting me to join this very esteemed panel. First, to answer your first question, I think we have got quite a bit of the answer in Masroor's presentation, particularly, but also in the comments by the other panelists. If you look at the unique features of the private sector, what are the unique features? The first is the private sector is usually very opportunistic. So they see opportunities of serving different markets, opportunities of responding to demand, and not only explicit demand, but often demand is latent. And the private sector is very good at identifying that latent demand. And in responding to it, the private sector is usually very agile, very fast, and does a great job of organization. By organization, I don't just mean the internal organization in the private sector, but also organizing resources, organizing capital, labor, and also even dealing with the regulatory apparatus in government, which, as we understood from the comments of several panelists, is something which is very difficult to navigate. So they do all that. And in the process, they also innovate, they experiment, they do course correction when necessary, very good at course correction, something which we don't always see in the public sector. So all these things happen in the private sector. And that's why I think that the private sector is a great asset for any country. And the question in front of us is, are we making the best use of that asset? And we are not talking, of course, of just commercial returns, which the private sector would be interested in, but returns for society as a whole. So I would say that that's why I agree with your comment that the private sector is a keystone. It's because of those attributes. And as I said, the question is, are we making the most of those attributes? And that brings us to the question of public policy. Now, we know that all these attributes, all these characteristics come into play with a lot of force because of the profit motive of the private sector. Now, often in societies, we take a negative view of the profit motive, but we must understand that that's the major driver for efficiency, a major driver for being opportunistic, a major driver for being innovative. So the job of public policy is to steer private activity in directions that are socially beneficial, that are good for the economy, that are good for the people, while recognizing that the prime driver will always be profits. So that's something that the government has to recognize. And often governments are lazy in the sense that they are not creative enough to come up with that solution, which doesn't militate against the profit motive of the private sector, but at the same time steers them towards activity which can be socially beneficial. So that requires a bit of creativity on the part of the public sector. Taking that point a little farther, we heard about inclusive, the role of private sector in supporting inclusive growth. And as mentioned before, there can be solutions within the private sector, but I'd like to bring forward one aspect of it, which is the role of the public sector in promoting private sector engagement in areas where the commercial viability is sometimes in question. So I said that the profit motive is a strong motive, but there are activities, for example, primary healthcare or primary education, and there are many such activities which may not be commercially viable, but socially very useful. Is this something which has to be kept reserved for government or NGOs? Not necessarily. Governments have a resource constraint, NGOs also have a resource constraint. So that model is not sustainable in the long run. The model which is sustainable is a commercial model. So the question is, how can the private sector, driven by profits, come into activities which are not intrinsically commercially viable? And this is where I think we have to make a distinction between public provision and public financing. So you can have a model where you have public financing combined with private provision. I'll just give one example, and this kind of arrangements are there in many countries, perhaps in Bangladesh as well, where a private sector competes on the basis of the lowest subsidy that they will ask for. So government is going to subsidize the provision of certain services because it's not commercially viable, but the private sector will get that contract. That private company will get a contract which will be able to do that at the lowest subsidy. So they bid on the basis of lowest subsidy. That's one example of a creative solution where you are harnessing all the attributes of the private sector that I mentioned before, while at the same time recognizing that this is not a commercially viable model, at least not initially, perhaps it will become over time. So that's just one example of that. Now, let me come back to Masroor's presentation, which was very, very rich. And I agree with you, Rubaiyat, that's going to be a very useful reference for us. I was wondering how to summarize his presentation, the very rich presentation. And then I looked at the title of today's presentation, and I looked at the names of the two sponsors of today's session. And in a sense, I got the answer there. So the title is The Role of the Private Sector in Bangladesh's Middle Income Journey. The middle income journey has two parts: how we came to becoming a middle income country, and Masroor gave many examples of the role of the private sector. But the next important question is, as we maintain our status as a middle income country, but also as we move towards being a developed country, which is the government's goal for 2041. I was told once that the goal is not high income, but developed income, but that's a major transition. And we know from experience that many middle income countries have got stuck where they are and have not made the transition. So why is that? And how do you make the transition? That brings me to the names of the two organizers. So Innovision Consulting. The word innovation is perhaps a mix of innovation and vision. I don't know, but that's how I'm reading it. Consulting, policy, exchange. So let me start with exchange. Exchange is all about trade. And in Masroor's presentation, this was very clear. One of the major goals for us going forward is to get a greater foothold in the global marketplace, diversify our exports, move from simple products to more sophisticated products like electronics. How do we do that? So that's the opportunity. For that, we need innovation. And the government has a role to create the enabling environment for the private sector to be innovative. That requires a certain degree of vision on the private sector, on the part of the government, and of course, the appropriate policies. So that's why I said innovation, vision, policy, and exchange, and that's where you have the summary, actually. Now, how well is the government doing on that front? Now, today's session is on the private sector, but I don't think we can have a discussion on the private sector without some comments on the public sector. And maybe, Rubaiyat, you may consider having a separate session on the public sector later. But I'll pick up from what Nihad Kabir had said and also what Abul Qasim Khan said, and just make some final comments. Nihad didn't say this in today's meeting, but I've heard her say this in other meetings, that a lot of what she says are exactly the same what her mother, Mrs. Laila Kabir, used to say many years ago when she was also president of MCCI. So the question is, why haven't things changed within the government at the speed at which we'd like to? Things have happened in the government. In fact, the government has helped create a facilitating environment for the private sector, but the pace has not been fast enough. And I think in order to understand that, we need to understand where the government is coming from and the different levels of government, the top policymakers, the mid-level officials. So Nihad mentioned the survey of businesses. We often do surveys of businesses. I recommend that we do surveys of government officials as well to understand their mindset, to understand where they're coming from. And if we do that survey, there's one thing you will discover. They're very concerned about risks. And they're concerned about risks because they don't know how to manage the risks. Risks will always be there. If you look at the developed economies, you will see that the governments have developed ways in which they can manage the risks. In Bangladesh, the government is still lacking in a knowledge of understanding risks and how to manage the risks. And because of that, they are very risk averse. And that's why you will see, for example, when Abul Qasim Khan was talking about outward foreign investment, which I think is strategically very important. And that's part of the vision story. But the government has been very, very conservative. Even though the amount of foreign exchange that the businesses are asking for at this stage is not that great. And that's why I would say that even with the foreign exchange constraint that we are facing now, I think that conversation should remain. I think the amount of foreign exchange the businesses are asking for to strategically invest abroad is still not that great that it's going to cause problems with us. So I would, contrary to what Abul Qasim was suggesting, that maybe this is not the time to discuss. No, I think it's still time to discuss. We should not use this excuse to postpone the discussion of outward foreign investment. That's very strategic. But the point I'm making is that there is a risk management issue within the government, and we need to understand that and see in what way can we improve the risk management capacities of government, because that is going to solve a lot of the problem. The final point I'll make is about regulatory environment. Nihad mentioned the need for regulations to be facilitatory, but regulations are there for a reason. Regulations are there to protect the environment, to protect the consumers, et cetera, et cetera. Enforcing these regulations, and as Nihad said, in a way which is not intrusive, but nonetheless, the social objectives, the environmental objectives of regulation are met. I think we have to find out solutions to do that. And finally, we should recognize that while there are many regulations on the book which are no longer relevant, Nihad mentioned that, we also have regulatory gaps. Mazdoor talked about the huge potential of the digital economy, but if we want to move towards the digital economy, we will find that there are many regulations which are needed, which are not there. I think all of you remember what happened when Uber first came to Bangladesh. The government was confused. Is it a taxi company? Is it an internet platform? Because they have never dealt with such a thing before. So you will see the lack of regulations is also going to be a major problem going forward. So let me stop there.
What a brilliant summary of the discussion that we had. Thank you so much, Dr. Bag. I don't need to summarize. So brilliant points, I think. I mean, the fact that you are saying, I mean, this is an important topic, and I would want to take it forward for future discussion, that the private sector in Bangladesh needs to go beyond the border. And you're saying that the amount of forex that they're asking for that is not obtrusive. What the government requires is risk management aptitude, capacity to improve, its know-how on risk management needs to improve, and its whole outlook towards risk needs to change. And you are asking for that. I mean, to start with, we have to remove our obsolete regulations, understand better about the government's facilitative role in facilitating innovation, visions and exchange. So these are very, very well noted. And I mean, before I conclude, Masroor Bhai, you have remained silent. Can you come back on the video, please, so that I can wrap up? There are some important points that were raised on the chat room, so I would like to throw it to your attention and then bring it all together and then close in next 10 minutes. So to begin with the end remark, FAO is working with the Ministry of Agriculture on the climate changes and resilient agriculture. I think one important point that came, and I can see from Ziaur Rahman, is that Bangladesh is facing climate change. And Masroor Bhai, you did speak about green investment becoming important. I think that's connected to climate change as well. But the point here is that climate change is real. We are observing the global, changes in value chains and systems. So what initiatives should be taken to involve private sector to combat climate change in business growth? Do you want to take, who wants to take that question? Masroor Bhai, Akhtar Bhai. Over to you.
Yeah, so can you hear me well now?
Right.
Okay. No, so very quickly, I think it's almost 5:37 p.m. Thursday, so I guess we should let the audience go and meet their friends and family for the weekend. So on the climate change, I think the narrative is changing, the strategy is changing. It used to be resilience, adaptation, mitigation. Now all of them remain valid. However, the strategic reorientation is that rather than using private sector only to deliver let's say adaptation or mitigation, basically green the growth process. So what is now the focus is greening of the growth process, and there, whether it's manufacturing or an infrastructure being developed or operated by the private sector, or services being developed, bring in the sort of climate lens into that, and sort of so basically what we are looking at is mainstreaming of environmental management and turning the risk and the resolution to the risk or the safeguarding of risk into business opportunities, right? So that's one. Saso from FAO had a question. I think what's stopping private investment in agriculture? So Saso, great question. I think Bangladesh has done really well in agriculture, and private sector played a good role, but the achievement has so far been limited in production success and sort of primary supply chain, where Bangladesh really could have been done a lot better and more is converting, building on that advantage and converting this whole agri agenda into commercial and industrial agriculture, adding value to the agro production and sort of bringing in agro services, processed food, agro processing and so on. That's what, now why does that happen? So first, this policy orientation wasn't there, taking advantage of agriculture, turning it into commercial and industrial agriculture. Second, good agricultural practices, productivity limitations or constraints that did not allow Bangladesh to have economies of scale in many of the sort of marketable, processable inputs production. Third, standards. It is food. We are looking at the most basic kind of intake people have directly linked to health and survival. The standards are quite, weak. And with that standards, very difficult to scale up domestic, particularly processed ones, but certainly very difficult to access international markets. Logistics, absence of that has led to huge post-harvest loss. Up to 45% are lost, what we produce. And certainly between the post-harvest and to the, market, every bit of the logistics value chain is missing. So just a few examples. So back to you, Rubaiyat.
Thank you so much, Masroor Bhai. Very comprehensive answer. Akhtar Bhai, there is a question for you from one of our students from North South University, economics student. I think the concern, the Sri Lanka experience has given rise to a lot of concerns in Bangladesh, and the question is related to that. So to you, the question is, do you think that our country might as well face such a crisis in the near future? Do we have enough diversity of our industries, or are we going to face something of a situation like Sri Lanka? Quickly over to you on that, Dr.
Thank you very much. So the Sri Lanka crisis has different dimensions, but I'll focus on the one which Anika has asked about, which is the relation between lack of diversity and crisis. I mean, there are other aspects of how the debt was managed, etc. I'm not going into that. Tourism and garments are not exactly the same. Tourism can be vulnerable to wide fluctuations. And we know in the Sri Lankan case, two things happened. One was the Easter bombings, I think 2 or 3 years ago, which obviously led to a big reduction in the number of tourists coming and the tourist revenues. And then there was COVID, of course. Now, these things has not affected garments as much. And historically, we'll see tourism, commodity export earnings, they fluctuate a lot. Garments doesn't fluctuate that much. So on that score, the vulnerability of Bangladesh is much less. But having said that, yes, there's always a possibility of being in a, if not a crisis situation, but in a difficult situation if you're not diversified enough. So I think the arguments that Masroor gave for diversification is indeed very strong. But the immediate answer is that, no, I don't think we should compare ourselves with Sri Lanka, either on the debt management situation or on the diversity situation.
Thank you so much. One final question, probably, to Masroor Bhai. What has been the impact of the industrial policy 1516 on private sector's development, and how the upcoming industrial policy could boost the private sector?
Industrial policy impact on private sector development. Is that the question, Rubai?
Yeah, industrial policy 2015 and 2016. And
I would say, let me be very frank and also brief. I think the impact is mixed. Industrial policy in Bangladesh is, I don't see it any differently than election manifesto and for that matter, the 5-year plans. Once they are, first of all, they're very wide open. They talk about pretty much everything under the sun. So don't prioritize, don't put a strategy, don't put a phasing or an implementation plan. Once they're developed, they pretty much gather dust at shelves, and they only become a reference point when a development partner or an economist is really writing a concept paper or a program documents that we used to develop in our organization in development as well, right? So that's the downward part, right? The government hardly uses the industrial policy as a kind of a directional reference point, to develop strategy, industries and strengthen their competitiveness. Upside of that, in absence of anything else, this at least provides a kind of a broad framework or framing around, okay, what are the kind of industries or business sectors which are considered as formal industries in the country, and as a result, a lot of the government policy support, particularly in the form of incentives, but also easier access to credits and so on, they actually emanate from what's focused on the industrial policy. So I would say the benefit or the impact was partial because of lack of focus, priority, and implementation strategy.
Bhai, you want to have a deliberation on this?
Yeah, just a very quick comment on the role of industrial policy. So we are hearing a lot about the Made in Bangladesh policy, and I'm told that this year's budget will also have several provisions for that. I would just like to say that it should be Made in Bangladesh efficiently policy, because when you have a Made in Bangladesh policy with a lot of protectionist measures, because most of them are like that, there's always a risk that the industries who are benefiting from the protectionist policy will find it an easy life, that they can get large profits without necessarily doing the kind of things that we have been talking about, innovation, productivity improvements, etc. So that's the trap of having a protectionist policy. Protection can also give them incentives to learn. So how do you make sure that your policy is helping them not to earn easy profits, but actually to learn and become more efficient over time? And that brings us back to the role of the government. When government gives support, they should ask performance in return, and they should have ways in which they will measure performance. That's exactly what the East Asians did. They gave a lot of support to the firms, but they demanded performance in terms of export increase. And they were very ruthless in withdrawing the support if that performance target was not met. In Bangladesh, industries, example, garments get a lot of support, but I'm not sure if government is demanding performance in return. At best, the performance is business as usual. So maintain your business as usual, and that's why we are giving you the support, but not using the support to catalyze change and actually measure whether that change is happening. So I think that's a very important discipline, and that's why I keep on saying should not be just made in Bangladesh efficiently.
Fantastic. I think there cannot be one final remark that could be better summing up the discussion that we have had. We need made in Bangladesh efficiently, and the government needs to veer away from its protectionist view and also make the private sector accountable for performance. I think that's a very great message that has come out. Thank you so much.
If I can add one thing,
Please,
there was a discussion on the chat regarding innovation in industry academia link up. I think that is the missing link in Bangladesh. We don't know what kind of research is happening in various universities or various people are doing what kind of research. There is no linkage. So innovation, let us not think innovation on the IT side only. Innovation can be anything. But we as business people don't know where the innovation or the creation is happening. And there is a lot of opportunities being missed because there is no linkage. And what we are trying to tell the government is that innovation should start at the home, at the household level, at the business level. Wherever you can innovate, you should be incentivized. So even if you, like in the budget last year, we said, even if a family is buying computers or smartphones or anything that educates its children or the family, they should be incentivized. They should get some tax benefit or reward for making it happen, because innovation starts at home. If you create at home, and that creation evolves into commercial creation. And from our chambers, we are trying to create an innovation center to link business, industry, and academia for moving Bangladesh to its goal of upper middle income and a developed country. Without innovation, with this kind of an advantage or demographic dividend, I think we have a window of opportunity to accelerate our growth in terms of innovating. And in the US, Akhtar Bhai may be knowing that if you invest in innovation or if you research, there is a matching fund provided by the government. So if you invest 2 million, the government also invests 2 million. So incentivize through a matching fund would be something not a revolutionary change, but a practice in the Western world. We should only see if we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for mentioning that the chamber is actually working on connecting these dots and it's trying to create an innovation center. I would really be interested to talk to you about that, because that's something that really interests us as an organization too. Is there any final remark from any of you, Akhtar Bhai, Masroor Bhai, before I finally close this brilliant discussion that we have had?
I just want to add one quick thing, and I think this has been highlighted, but just to reiterate, I think what all of us, I think are realizing is that whatever we are introducing, like that, let it be green economy, the new innovation, it all comes with a cost. So I think we always are thinking about how the private sector can absorb that, because, we're talking about risk, right? So I think that's where all these strategies should all collaborate or coordinate, that how does the private sector cover the cost of becoming more innovative or becoming more green. I just want to double iterate that, although it was mentioned.
So matching grant could play a role. So
yes, definitely, exactly. That's where we should step in. Investment should step in. Absolutely.
Super. Any other final remark, Akhtar Bhai, Masroor Bhai, Mummy?
I have just one for me. I've spoken enough, I think. Rubaiyat, look forward to the next exciting discussion.
Akhtar Bhai.
No, the comment I'll make is that the benefits of the private sector, all the characteristics that I mentioned, are best exploited when there's competition in the marketplace. So a market economy is good if it's a competitive economy. So in Bangladesh, we have a lot of policies which are business friendly. I'm not sure we have enough policies which are market friendly in the sense of promoting competition. So the important transition we need to make is from business friendly policies to market friendly policies. And what we must guard against is a movement in the other direction, which is called crony-friendly policies, because that's where a lot of the middle-income countries have got stuck. So business-friendly policies, moving to market-friendly, and not in the other direction.
Fantastic. All these points that you have mentioned, we will try to reflect on our policy brief. It will also come out on the Financial Express as a press release. But more importantly, we're going to have a supplement on Financial Express on all the important discussions that we have had in this season. So this will all be summarized and presented as a supplement on Financial Express. But as Innovation Consulting, I mean, we believe in partnerships. So through our partnerships with the likes of Policy Exchange and with all of you, we would strive to take this forward. So thank you so much for everyone who has joined from all around the world. Thank you so much to Policy Exchange for facilitating today's discussion. Thank you so much, Akhtar Bhai, Mr. Khasham Khan, Fawzia Nasreen, Muid, and Nihad Abul, who has left us. So all of you, thank you so much. Take my salam. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Bye-bye.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you.
Good to see you, Akhtar Bhai.